Chapter 2, August 23rd, AD 79, the afternoon before Main Street, Pompeii. Marcus walked along the dusty main street of Pompeii, carrying a smelly sack stuffed with his master's dirty laundry. It was early afternoon, and the street was packed with people. Shoppers sifting through bins of pomegranates and melons, weary slaves collecting water from the fountains, beggars holding out their grimy hands. A snake charmer dozed while his cobra peeked out of the basket, tasting the air with his flickering tongue. Marcus said, a friendly Latin hello for the deadly reptile. If only he had a basket to hide in right now. There were no good days for Marcus lately, but this day was sure to be more miserable than usual. It was broiling hot outside, and his raged tunic was soaked in sweat. Even worse, his master, Festus Julius, was expecting important guests from Rome this evening, friends of the emperor. This meant every more backbreaking work than usual for Marcus and the other slaves. For days they'd been scrubbing the villa so that the mosaic floors shine like diamonds, so that every silver bowl and goblet gleamed. The guests would arrive by chariot, men in flowing white togas, women in silk robes and with painted red lips, jewels flashing from every finger. Tonight there would be a great feast of roasted flamingo and wild boar, honey-baked mice stuffed with raisins and dates, and lobsters as big as cats. The guests would lounge on silken couches and gorge themselves until they threw up, and then, their stomachs empty, they would eat more. Tomorrow, Festus would take them all to the gladiator fight at Pompeii's amphitheater. From front row seats, they would cheer as the warriors tried to stab one another to death with swords, spears, and daggers. People were coming from all over to see the spectacle, which featured Pompeii's champion fighter. He was a giant of a man who had lost an eye in one of his early battles. The injury had earned him the fighting name of Cyclops, after the one-eyed monster from the old Greek tales. Like most all gladiators, Cyclops was a slave who was forced to fight, but he was one of the lucky few, still alive after many battles. Just thinking about these brutal tournaments horrified Marcus. Suddenly, his whole body was shaking. But wait, it wasn't Marcus who was trembling. It was the earth beneath his feet. Marcus dropped his sack and braced himself against a stone fountain. A huge marble statue of the warrior Achilles looked down on him. Marcus wished he had felt as brave as Achilles. But these tremors spooked him for weeks. They'd been shaking the city, putting cracks in the walls of Festus's villa, sending his spoiled dogs into fits of howling. Usually the quakes were quick, ending in just a few seconds. Most people seemed to barely notice them, but this quake was more powerful than most. The ground shuddered and shook, harder and harder. Up and down the street, the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood and crumbling stone pounded Marcus's ears. Crash, crack, bang. Vendors cursed as their baskets of fruit and vegetables toppled. A bamboo birdcage fell and bursted open, scattering a flock of tiny white birds into the dusty air. Barrels rolled wildly through the streets, gushing wine as red as blood. Marcus held tight to the fountain as the water inside is slooshed, splashing over the rim and soaking his tunic. tunic. And then he heard it, a creaking just over his head. Marcus looked up, and just as the massive marble statue of Hercules came crashing down on top of him. Chapter 3. Marcus dove to the ground, his chin smacking the hard stone. He braced himself for the crushing blow of thousands of pounds of marble hitting him. He heard a terrible crash, but he felt nothing. He peeled open his eyes and peered around him. To his amazement, the broken statue was just behind him. It must have sailed right over him. Marcus whispered a thank you to the gods. Poor Hercules had lost his head, which was now rolling slowly in the street. Marcus could practically hear the warriors' deathly cries, but Marcus himself was in one piece, and the earth had stopped shaking. Marcus pulled himself up. He put his hands to his chin, and it came away streaked with blood. Otherwise, he was unhurt. A humpbacked street vendor came up to him. "Don't even think about stealing those apples," he barked, reaching down and snatching 2 apples that had escaped from his basket. "I wouldn't," Marcus said, spotting a third hidden behind the fountain. He should give it to the man he knew, but just the thought of the juicy apple made his stomach flip with joy. Festus fed his slaves nothing but watery gruel and old cheese. The fruit seller didn't spot it, and Marcus said nothing. "That giant beast must be restless," said the man, spitting on one of the apples and rubbing it against his rough tunic. "Giant," Marcus said. "Everyone knows that's why the earth is shaking," the man replied, looking at Marcus as though he must be stupid not to know this. "There's a great beast living under the mountain. Every few years it wakes up and the city shakes. Then it goes to sleep again." Marcus thought of his father, Tata. Talk of monsters and magic always made Tata shake his head. Tata said it was only natural that people would make up stories or blame the gods for what they couldn't understand. Wild storms and killing fevers, dead crops and mad dogs. But science always held the answer, Tata believed, if you looked hard enough. Marcus didn't say this now. It wasn't right for a slave to correct the opinion of a free man, even if the man was just a poor fruit seller. What amazed Marcus was that the people in Pompeii just accepted these tremors, shrugging them off as they would a rainstorm. Even now, shoppers were already back to haggling for bargains. The fruit seller turned away, and Marcus grabbed the hidden apple, slipping it into his pocket. He picked up the heavy laundry sack and threw it onto his back with a sigh. Festus wouldn't care if a monster really had come stomping through Pompeii. Marcus had better get back to his master's villa soon, or he'd be greeted with a beating. He was turning to leave when he noticed an old woman sitting in the street, dazed. The shaking must have knocked her down. Passers-by stepped around her as if she were a heap of trash. Marcus ignored the woman. There were bargainers everywhere, after all. But she looked so miserable. With a sigh, he once again dropped the laundry sack. He went to the woman, crouching down next to her. She was a beggar, it seemed, her tunic stained and tattered, her bare feet crusted with sores. She scowled at him. "Scat thief." "I wasn't going to steal anything," Marcus said. He should have ignored the hag like everyone else did. But then the woman's face softened. She studied Marcus with her cat-like green eyes. She was very old, with sagging cheeks and deep wrinkles, but Marcus could imagine that a long time ago she might have been pretty. "What do you want then?" she asked. Almost without thinking, he reached into his pocket and took out the apple. "Here," he said. She looked hungrier than he was. The woman took the apple in one of her gnarled hands. "Help me up, please." Marcus held her arms and she got to her feet and stood with her as she steadied herself. And then she suddenly grabbed his hand, gripping it with surprising strength. "Be careful, kind boy," she whispered. "I have seen the signs. Terrible doom is coming for the people of Pompeii." She leaned so close that he smelled the strange spices on her breath. "When hope is lost, follow the hand of Mercury." She stepped back. "Do you understand?" Marcus had no idea what she meant. All over Pompeii, there were statues of the powerful messenger god, with his winged sandals and helmet. But what did that matter to him? "I understand," he lied. Now he just wanted to get away from her. "The end is coming," she said, finally letting go of his hand. "The world will burn."